Welcome to the Married People Podcast, where we help you make marriage real, fun, and simple. Each week, we have honest conversations about one simple thing that can make your marriage better. Because when your marriage is better, everything's better. I'm CJ, and as always, I have the pleasure of sitting here with our resident newlywed, Afton.
Hi.
And our 23-year marriage veteran. He's an author, speaker, and the director of marriedpeople.org, Ted Lowe.
Hello, everybody.
And today on the Married People Podcast, we're going to look at the question, how can my church help marriages? Now, Ted, when I originally saw this question, I was a little thrown off because this podcast is primarily all about how to help me make my marriage as good as it can be. And we're kind of turning the tables a little bit and talking about, hey, what does it look like to help others have great marriages too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So this whole podcast is based on, wanting people to know that marriage is real and fun and simple. And so it was birthed out of actually our organization, Orange. And I oversee Married People, which is the marriage division of Orange. And so Orange is all about resourcing churches to help the next generation. And so we've wanted to do that for a long time. So we've been poured into churches for the last 8 years, trying to help churches help marriages, because I really do feel like, there's no marriage that thrives in isolation, that we've got to surround them with people. And I think the local church is the perfect way to do that. And I feel like when churches do that really well, it's really, really powerful.
Yeah. I think a lot of times we don't realize how much we can actually help other people improve their own marriages too, as a couple, as a married couple. And a great way to do that is through the local church. But we'll get to that in a minute. But before we get there, Afton, you grew up in church, right?
Yes.
You went to Bible college and all of that stuff. So
I'm just the golden child of church world.
Okay. So you have all of that background. Can you remember growing up anything about marriage ministry? Do you remember anything like with your parents doing marriage ministry? Do you remember anything like that growing up?
No. I don't think I'd ever even heard of marriage ministry till I started working at Orange. And I was like, what? Are we supposed to be doing that? I didn't know. But I've also never seen any church doing it. I mean, it's not often that you find a church that has somebody on staff that is in charge of the marriages in the local church.
Right. And you still don't. And I think that's the thing. And that when we started talking about, should we do a podcast on this? I said yes, because a lot of marriage ministries are actually supported and ran by volunteers. Mm-hmm. So people that are passionate about marriage, if they're passionate about marriage, they're listening to this podcast to say, hey, maybe this is something that I could bring into our church that I could tell leadership about, or just it's a great resources, again, to help the church help marriages.
I think a lot of churches do a great job of prioritizing, obviously, what happens in, the main service and even children's ministry. Sure. Why do you think that marriage ministry and the marriages in a church are sometimes put on the back burner?
I think that children's ministry and student ministry and Sunday morning lives in this whole category of this is important and this is urgent. Mm-hmm. I think marriage ministry lives in the category of this is important, but it's not urgent. Mm-hmm. But when you start looking statistically at where marriages are and what marriages does to a kid's faith, it is urgent and it is important. But I think it's a category that we've watched change, and hopefully we've been a part of that change since 2010, where churches are saying, hey, maybe the best thing we can do for kids is help marriages, because marriages are so much a part of the development of a kid in the right or wrong way, especially when it comes to their faith.
So it's interesting that you say it's not urgent, because I do feel like every church has a plan for marriages that are in crisis, or like the marriage counseling route, like, hey, we're going to work on the marriage that's hanging on by a shoestring. But what happened, but the whole...
And normally, normally then...
Go ahead, cut me off after.
Yeah, I mean, you looked like you needed some help too.
Oh, yes. Yes.
I feel like normally, I think normally it's usually an individual or a couple coming to the church saying, I need help.
Right.
And that's when they're like, oh, yeah, we care about your marriage now. But before it wasn't like, oh, when I just got married and I was a newlywed, you were just like, hope the Sunday morning sermon works out for you, Yeah. Be nice to people.
But the whole idea of children's programming and main service programming is, hey, let's almost address some of these things before they become issues. Let's help you get your children off on the right foot. Let's help you get your relationship with God off on the right foot. And that's what married people is, right? It's like, hey, let's not wait till we get to that point. there's a strategy that we can start working on now, to make your marriage that isn't even in crisis great, right?
Right, exactly. And so the tension that we started wrestling with at the very beginning, which was
Yeah.
in 2010, prior to that, I'd worked at North Point Church as the director of married life. So we were doing marriage ministry here in Atlanta and in local churches. But when we started and kind of looked at what's going on in 2010, there was this study by the Ullman Family Foundation about how people saw marriage ministry, what their perception. And it came back that marriage ministry is boring, preachy, outdated, and feminine. So I bet most of the people listening to this goes, oh, that can't be true, because people who have experienced marriage ministry a lot of time in local churches, it has been those things. Yet maybe some of our listeners are connected to Orange and Orange churches, and they say, no, we go to church is the opposite of that. And maybe some of these churches are actually even using married people resources because we create a strategy and the resources to come behind it. So we have watched church leaders build. In fact, we have a Facebook page for church leaders, married people leaders, and there's 1,900 people on there. So I go, wow, I didn't know 1,900 people cared about marriage ministry, but it's a category that's growing and it's very positive, and we're getting very excited about that. But again, a lot of churches struggle with the fact that marriage ministry has an image problem.
I never thought about some of this stuff until I got married, because I didn't see this growing up. We didn't go to church a whole lot growing up either, so that was part of it too. But now that I'm an adult and I've seen some of this marriage ministry stuff, I've also seen it done well. So my local church does a lot of stuff for married couples, and I'm not really sure what I thought about going into some of those, but as we got married, Terry, my wife, was the one who spearheaded going to those kinds of events, and I guess that's probably stereotypical.
Sure.
And I don't know what I thought going into some of those things, but I could definitely resonate with what you're saying as far as the connotations are that it's going to be boring, preachy, tell me what I'm doing wrong, tell me I need to stare at my wife and hold her hands and like we need to just cry together or something like that. And that's not the case, or at least it doesn't have to be the case. And I've had a great experience at some of those kinds of things. Afton, have you ever been to a marriage event? Let me just start there.
No. Never been to a marriage event, but I'm new to marriage.
That's true. Yeah.
So
how long
I
are we
haven't
going to
had a
say?
lot of-
How long are we going to say that you're the newlywed?
I don't know.
on
How
this?
long do you get to be a newlywed?
How long
We're
have you been
just
married?
over 2 years.
I mean, I think you're aging out of that a
I
little
know.
bit.
I am aging out of
Yeah.
it.
But-
That's okay.
So 2 years.
2 years and never had a desire to go to a marriage event. I think for me, it's sort of what you're saying. I always felt like marriage events would be a lot of stereotypes, like, women, isn't it annoying when husbands leave their socks on the floor? It's like, okay, like, all right, like I don't, okay, it's just.
Right.
It was getting into territory that I don't even like to be around. Like that's what I envisioned married nights being like. And I also think there's something weird about I'm new to marriage, but I think there's something weird about like, let's go to this workshop to work on this one relationship you have in your life. It's like, sure, it's an important relationship you have, but like, where
One
are
of the most important.
Where's the mother-daughter workshop event or the mother-sister, sister-sister workshop event? It's like, why is this one like? It just all feels so weird to me.
It still feels so weird to you. Awesome.
It still feels weird to me.
Well, hopefully by the end of this, we'll make it not feel quite so weird.
Well, that's
But that's to say I've never
Yeah.
been. I've not been to one. I'm just saying my perception of them, and I haven't been to
Yeah.
one. But you've been to one, CJ. So you.
I mean,
you know.
I've been to a handful of them.
I've been involved in things that weren't necessarily like church married things. Like I went to this one thing where we got very in depth into like the kind of movies we watched, and we read really in depth. Like, oh, Afton, you've got mail. Here's what that says about you and your relationship with Hudson. And I felt even weird about that, where I'm like, oh, just let me like the movies I like, and it doesn't don't read into this too much.
I get
so I just
that.
feel like I've been in scenarios where it's like the marriage relationship is like just
I think-
brought into this magnifying glass, and it's like it's annoying to me.
I think there's less of that than you would think. Just because, I mean, we went to one a couple of months ago, and it was a comedy night, and it's like, hey, I mean, it was great to laugh and you learn a few things about your marriage. And by the way, it's not like we walked out of there and we're like, wow, our relationship's changed forever. But it's just the consistent, like, hey, we're doing something to continually grow in our marriage. That over time, I think it has a cumulative effect. It's like being in a small group. It's not like you go to small group and you have that one small group and it's like, wow, we're changed forever. But it's the continued investment in community that eventually grows you in your faith. It's the same kind of thing. When you go to some of these things over time, it grows you in your marriage. And so, Ted, I think this is going to be interesting because you have a bit of a skeptical audience here. And I'm not just talking about Afton, but like I care about my marriage, and I guess I'm sticking up a little bit for marriage events. But at the same time, you still have two people here, Ted, who aren't involved in helping our church, implement a marriage strategy for other couples. So walk us through, hey, what does it look like for two people, Afton and I, to be sitting here? How do we help our church help marriages? What does that look like?
Yeah, so I think, Afton, I'm so glad, once again, for your candor and honesty. But
I'm kind of glad.
Yeah,
okay,
sure.
Okay. Ted is so glad.
But I think marriage ministry is where youth ministry was in like the 70s and 80s. It was a little bit, why are we highlighting this?
That's a great example.
Well, what was happening was the future of the church was graduating in the form of a high school student. So they would graduate from high school and they graduate from their faith because there wasn't anything that spoke just to them in that season where they were. So then great organizations like Young Life and Youth for Christ went, wait a minute. They noticed this even before the church. And they said, we've got to be relevant. We got to go where kids are. We got to do environments that these kids really, really like. And they connected them. And all of a sudden the church went, oh, we need to do that too. Now, in every church in the country, sometimes a youth pastor is the second hire next to the pastor.
Yeah.
And so it's, whoa, this is really important. I think the same thing is happening a lot is the future of the church is kind of walking out in the form of families breaking up. I mean, there's a scary stat in the Journal of Scientific Study of Religion that says that and this is so depressing, I don't even know if I should bring it up, that 60% of kids that come from divorce will walk away from their faith. Well, we don't say that out loud because that's defeating. Somebody's listening right now, and this was completely defeating for them. They've just turned this podcast off. They're going to pull to the side of the road and cry. Right. But I think it's something that we have to acknowledge, especially as church leaders, and people are passionate about kids and kids' faith, to go, wow, the marriage relationship is more formative and more important than maybe we've led to believe. So the question is, if the church isn't doing it, then who is doing it? And even, secular research has come out when it comes to saying helping marriages. Secular research is saying the church should and is the best place to do it. Like they believed in the church helping marriages before the church has. So the good news is watching churches, when they do it well, when they do it in a way where they address people that's got pushbacks like you, and typically it's more of a male pushbacks that you're having.
I always love when you do that, Ted.
I love it.
I bet Hudson would love to go to a
Hudson
marriage
is probably the one that's like, we should go to this marriage retreat. And I'm like, no, Hudson, no.
Right. And so somebody, usually when there is role reversal, then it is complete role reversal. The spouse is also feeling this as well. And so we went, okay, with tough audiences, with one, they're going, let's see, what can we want to do this weekend? Well, we can go hang out, go camp, and do whatever we want to, or we can go to church and be stuck inside the building. So we knew from the very beginning that we had quite the mountain that we had to tackle. And so this is from what I'm about to share is based on a lot of research, a lot of years, lots of churches, lots of input. I think the first thing we have to acknowledge is what we don't want to do. And I think there's a couple of approaches that fall short. The first one's the hands-off approach, when a church just said, you know what, we're so busy, we're not going to do that. If people just come on Sunday mornings and be in small groups and serve, then their marriages will be great. Yeah. I wish that was true. I really do. I wish there was no need for marriage ministry. I really, really do. I wish that was enough. But what stats are showing is that it's not. That church needs to do more. The other one is a lot of times churches will treat marriage like a topic to be covered. It's like they're brainstorming from the years. What are we going to talk in our sermon series? Well, we can talk about Philippians and money, and how about marriage? Yeah, that's the thing. Yeah, we're hearing stories we don't like to hear. Let's do that. The problem is marriage is not a topic. It's not like finances. It's not like missions. It's this process. It's this relationship. And we say this, marriage is not a topic to be covered, but a relationship that needs to be cared for and discipled.
Yeah.
So we can't treat it like that. The last one is the reactionary approach. And this is when churches says, you know what, we'll reach out to couples when they reach out to us.
Yeah.
Which
is what we were talking about a few minutes ago, that marriage counseling when your marriage is falling apart kind of a thing.
Totally. And a lot of churches don't even have a plan for that. They get a phone call and all of a sudden the pastor stops his day and went, oh my gosh, this couple is falling apart. This family's falling apart. I need to stop everything I'm doing to help them, which I love that heart. The problem is what I found in being in marriage ministry for all these years, a lot of times when couples come to the church, they're not looking for reconciliation. They're looking for justification. They want to be able to say, especially if they have kids, we tried everything. We even talked to the church and we couldn't make it work. So a lot of times by the time they're reaching out, it's a little bit too late. And we've got to reach out to couples while they'll still take our hands, right? We got to teach them why they're still teachable. And what I've found is couples are teachable up until the very last minute. We just got to get a little ahead of the game. We can't wait for them to raise the red flag. We got to get ahead of the game to do this thing.
Wow. That's interesting, Ted, because now it's not something that I think Afton and I naturally think about, obviously. We're not thinking about marriage ministry in our day-to-day lives, especially not like you are. But now that you talk about some of those ways that churches approach ministry, and to recap, you said, sometimes it's a hands-off approach, sometimes it's just a topical approach, and sometimes it's a reactionary approach. Those aren't great ways to approach any kind of ministry, let alone marriage ministry. Like, hey, you don't raise your kids or have children's ministry or any programming that's like, hey, it's a hands-off thing until they run into a problem, or it's a hands-off thing until they're in crisis. Like, that's no way to do any kind of ministry, let alone marriage ministry.
That's true, but I think it's also true of people that are in marriages that we don't think about trying to work on our marriages until something goes wrong.
We carry the same mindset we have in our marriages into the way we lead our churches.
Right. I'm just like, why would I go to a marriage event? Everything's fine, and I'm only been married 2 years. I'm doing great. Like, I don't need to go listen to some guy talk about socks on the floor.
You are doing great.
Thank you. Obviously, I am. I'm the star of this podcast because of all of the great advice that I give that you tell me is wrong. But I think that's probably why they lead their churches that way too, because it's like everything's great until it's not. So I guess what's difficult in marriage ministry in general, and what's difficult even talking to us, is it's like, no, you need to be working on things now, and it's hard to get people to care while they feel like everything's fine.
Absolutely. I always equate it to parenting. Like, I find myself not Googling things until, it's tough. And we work for a company. A lot of the goal is to help parents to be good parents, and especially spiritually. And so I get it. Your thing, you always feel like your thing's the most important thing. So I get the pushbacks on that. I think what I've watched over the last probably 8 years, especially, is churches shifting, making these paradigm shifts. And hopefully we've been a part of that and married people to help churches do that I think all of a sudden it becomes more relevant to your world is. And then there's some kind of direction that makes you understand that, hey, don't wait until it gets to this point. But I feel like that's the church's responsibility to cast that vision through stories, through reality, through acknowledging that they understand your world, that they've really got to let it be known. It's the church's job to paint that, because nowhere in culture is it like waving a red flag saying, slow your life down, spend time as a couple. It doesn't do that. People live in these imaginary worlds of what marriage is supposed to be, this magical chemical thing, and then it's not happening. People are disappointed.
Yeah. And I think if my church or the church I was going to, if they made it a natural part of their program or their strategy as a church to work on relationships, I feel like my church talks about small groups all the time. My church talks about, serving and giving, and
that's a great
these
point.
are things you should always be doing, and that's just a part of the strategy. It's part of the culture of the church. If this was if marriage, working on your marriage was just a part of the strategy, I'd probably buy into it a little bit more and go, oh, okay, it normalizes it. Like, oh, it's like small groups. It's like giving. It's like, it's like serving. It's like working on our relationship because it's important. If that was just a part of the strategy, I'd probably be more inclined to get into it.
When it's as it is, which is like a one event, maybe like every couple of years kind of thing, or it's just a small line in a handout somewhere or something, and it's less part of a strategy.
They care about this twice a year, so it's obviously not that big of a deal.
I think that is perfectly said, and that is the heart of what we're doing all the time, is to go, make this a part of your church's passion and strategy. Make marriage a part of this. And the thing I get really passionate about it in terms of millennials, a lot of them, I think I read the thing the other day, 58% of millennials that grew up in church are leaving the church. But millennials, their top two priorities are to be a great parent and to have a great marriage. And so
Yeah.
you're going, if the church, if we can get this right, that's a great way to draw millennials into the church. And it's a great way for us to serve this generation that's now represents the largest population of our culture right now, in our country right now, is how do we serve them? How do we help them they want great marriages. And that's the thing that gets so frustrated about, with millennials. What we get told about millennials is they don't care about these kind of things. And they really do. They care about their marriage and they care about being good parents.
Yeah, we're millennials, right?
Yeah.
Right after.
I've actually found a lot of my friends and the people that are in my age group, like I even listen to this really dumb podcast, this like morning talk show podcast for millennials, and they care about they're both getting married and they like really care about it. They even this morning when I was listening to it, they talked about like how they grew up in a home with divorced parents, and they were like, it's our goal to not be that
Right.
now. And there was
Yeah.
they were talking about a swing to like, we've witnessed all the divorce, what the divorce situation does to us, and we're working so hard to not be that. So
Yeah.
I do feel like in my group of friends, it's no one's treating marriage lightly anymore. Or,
That's great
for
point.
us.
Yeah, for sure. I agree with that. I feel the same way. Like I've watched my parents go through the divorce stuff, and one of my things is like, man, yeah, you always want to do better than your parents, and especially in this area, I think for us, for Terry and I, it's like, hey, we really, really want to get this right, and so we really do care about our marriage and setting it up for success. Now, Ted, if people are listening to this and they're like, hey, this episode's called "How Can My Church Help Marriages?" They're like, I'm just a person. I don't know what that means for me. We're going to get there, what they can do, right?
Right, absolutely.
So let's get into now, hey, what does it look like? What does a good marriage ministry look like? Let's talk about that and then talk about, hey, what can couples do who are interested in helping others in their church get connected?
So one of the things we're really passionate about, despite the fact that we create resources, is more than them just implementing resources. I want them to make paradigm shifts, that we've got to make paradigm shifts as a church to what we're currently doing. Even if not doing anything, these shifts are, what are we going to do differently to reach the next generation? What is that going to look like? Really quickly, one of the shifts is move from intervention to intervention and prevention. That churches would, we got a plan for someone calls in there in crisis, but what's your plan for prevention? What are your
That's
proactive
great.
pieces? What are those events that you went to and went, wow, this was hopeful and this gave me some direction? Like, what are those proactive pieces? It's the podcast. The podcast so far, at least, has not been designed for couples in crisis. It's this proactive thing that somebody can do as they're, going for a run or they're in their car to go, hey, let's talk about this stuff now when it comes up. We just got through talking about in-laws. Well, how great is it to have some proactive information and then something happens, you go, oh, I remember that podcast. I mean, how many times do I hear people say, I remember in premarital counseling? Like, people remember those things a lot of times.
Yeah.
And that mattered to them. Why? Because they got proactive. And because they were proactive and they were really interested in their relationship at that time, right? Never you more into your relationship than before it started as a marriage. And so I want to go from intervention to intervention and prevention.
And I think when you hear prevention, I mean, because I'm like the guy in the relationship, I like don't have a lot of feelings. It's like when you think about prevention resources, it's not just from knowing some of the resources that married people for church resources come out with, because we get to hear about some of the things we create. They aren't always like, let's have this heavy conversation in order to have this preventative strategy. It's like for couples, I feel like what y'all do, and married people for churches is give churches like really easy, practical things that we could, like, just to work on your relationship. Like, go on a date and ask this silly question and have fun, and here's some ways to do it. And so it's not a heavy thing for couples to do on our end. It's not like, in order to prevent a divorce, here are the 5 major conversations you're going to have.
Yeah.
It's like, just know each other, have fun together, and have a intentional date time together.
Yeah.
And what's more preventative than enjoying each other, right? What's more preventative than couples going and dating? Like, I love that. So people look at the date nights we create and they go, well, that doesn't seem very spiritual. And I'm like, neither is divorce.
Right.
Go and we create dates and the only goal is for people to laugh and to affirm each other. And that's a win for us.
Yeah.
So I think it's this, instead of dump truck loading all this content on somebody once a year or once every 5 years as a church, let's give them less content more often.
That's great.
Right?
And help them work into the rhythm of their marriage. Like, we set aside time that's not supposed to be heavy time. It's just supposed to be have fun and be encouraging. And that helps the couple get into a rhythm of
Yeah.
doing that on their own too.
That's great.
I mean, we do things. I'm very passionate about Post-it notes. Like, how do you use a Post-it note to affirm your spouse today? Like, people go, that's a really low bar. And I'm like, exactly, because the average couple's talking 4 minutes a day. You can't tell them to do all this deep, heavy stuff, but you have these little moments. You know, we talked about micro moves kind of toward the first of the podcast. That's all we want to do is help them. We want to be the cue of that. You go do that.
So Ted, all right. So what else does it look like for a church to get this right, to get marriage ministry right?
Another shift that we encourage churches to move from just having a children's ministry or student ministry to family ministry, and that's really seeing that one of the ways that we helped kids are to help families.
Yeah.
So seeing that more as, oh, wow, this really is important in the development of a kid. Because, we live in a very kid-centric culture, and a lot of our churches are very kid-centric, and that's all great, and there's no bad heart there. But if we really even want to lean in on this is important to kids, is their parents' marriage, so we say move in that direction. Another one is moving from isolation to relationship. How can the church pull couples who are living in what we say the community of two into some relationship, to people that are for them? I mean, hopefully even people feel a relational dynamic listening to the podcast, that we're all friends and we have, we all encourage each other, and hopefully we want to encourage other people into relationship, but we think that that's what the church should be all about. So how do we pull marriages into relationship, like small groups? Like, how do you have people in there that's for your marriage?
I think Ted said you were encouraging there, Afton. I don't know if you caught that, but
He
that
must
was
not really know my tones of voices.
like all this sarcasm. Ted's just taking it as
He's
like,
taking
oh
it
wow,
face value.
Yeah.
right.
I know under that tough exterior is a really soft heart.
Yeah.
Or not. Maybe
Or
not.
not, yeah.
We're not
Who
sure.
knows?
All right, Ted. So you've talked about 3 of the 7 shifts that churches can make as they approach marriages. What else were you looking at here?
Yeah, I'm very passionate about this one especially. It's moving from information to experience, because there's all this great content when it comes to marriage, and it's been there forever. There's tons of books, there's tons of websites, there's a ton of these things. How do we help people to experience this? Because millennials especially are very experiential, and that's what I'm very hopeful about millennials is when you create an experience for them to enjoy, like a date night, they'll bite. I mean, even in our company, when we've given out people date nights, it's the millennials that do them. All the older folks are, we're too tired or whatever to do it. But millennials especially are very experiential. So instead of having people read a book on the power of affirmation, what if you sent them on the date and had them to fill in the following blank? The thing about you that makes me say, wow, is this. How do we set them up to affirm each other?
Yeah.
So really moving from this mountain of content to like, hey, let's help them to laugh. How do you help them experience a laugh? How do you experience, it's what we do every week on this podcast is how do we help them to experience this and not just know some information.
That's great. I didn't even realize that you kind of set us up that way from week to week. Yeah, it is always an experience. It's not go read this, and stare into your spouse's eye. It is very experiential.
Yeah.
You're giving us your secrets, Ted.
Good. That's the goal. That's the goal. The other thing we want to move from feminine to feminine and masculine. For so many years, and again, it's not anyone's bad heart. It was just to create these marriage events where they would have a guy beat up guys for not being wired more relationally like women, or even doing those stereotypes. Like that drives me nuts. Like you said, leaving his socks on the floor.
Right.
I hate doing gender stereotypes. At the same time, I think when you're creating an environment, you've got to create it in such a way that it's appealing to both men and women. So one of the things I watch all the churches, we have churches all over the country that are using married people, and we'll say, what is a man thinks he's going to walk into a marriage event and it's going to look like a Valentine's Day banquet, and then he's going to get beaten up, or women thinking this too. Here's a ton of content. Here's staring into each other's eyes, and that you want to flip that on its head. That they walk in, the music's up, the lights up, the music. I call it Braves game music. It's music people from 8 to 80 love. It kind of interjects some energy into that. So he's walked in and goes, oh, this looks a little bit different than I thought. And then it's a night that's fun. It's a night that says we're going to laugh. It's a night that people get to connect with other couples. And somebody says, hey, tonight we're going to focus on just one thing. Not 1,000 things, one thing. And that's powerful for your marriage. Then all of a sudden I can sit back, I can relax and go, so we want to move that to a thing where things are appealing to both men and women. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, obviously I would prefer that since I'm probably the one that leaves my socks on the floor and Hudson's the one that's mad about it, you know?
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of role reversals kind of going on, even like just who stays at home with the kids or who's the breadwinner or whatever, like all those stereotypes that we grew up with. I feel like we're just in a time where those aren't true anymore. And if we keep assuming they are, people are going to walk in and walk right back out because that's not me, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I had a lady walk up to me after an event and she says, I'm a pediatric dentist and my husband stays home with our 2-year-old. And so everything's reversed. And then she just broke out crying. She goes, I feel like he's a better person than I am. He's doing all this. She goes, I just go to work. And I pause and go, wait, you going to work allows him to be able to stay home. But I think you're so right to go, we're talking to a different generation. We're talking where, Nancy and I live in very much role reverse a lot of times with how we process and how we talk. So I think it's just speaking to both sides of feminine and masculine and just making it appealing.
Yeah.
And I do think you will have, it's usually 75% of the time it is the stereotypical, it's the man that doesn't want to come more than the woman.
Sure.
So I think you can do things environmentally that are going to make him feel safe. Like one of our churches, they put a barbecue grill in the foyer of their church and they said, somebody's going to win this barbecue at our next event. So I spoke at the event, I walked in and they had football helmets on every table. They had like tailgate food, they served it. You could get your picture made in front of a goalpost. And then they gave away the barbecue grill. And so it was one of those things where I thought, that's appealing to both men and women, especially that poor woman who had to drag her husband there. Right? I always want to make her win by making it a win for him. Because I've gotten that for years. I've gotten women saying, thank you for making that a great place for my husband.
Yeah.
So that's just that's a big shift. And it's a thing. And churches are not going to think that. Like, so if you say, hey, we're going to have an event, the lady that typically does the events, you say marriage, what does she think? Romantic and feminine and flowers. And we go, no, you got to turn that on its head. It's just a shift that most churches don't think about.
Right.
So we've encouraged them to do that. I think moving from general to focus, I think there's so much content. I call it, content mountain. That there's great content on marriage, but how do we hone it down? How do we pull this down into 4 things? It's like the book, Your Best Us, we mention on the show a lot of times.
Yeah.
There are 4 things in there. There are 4 things based on 4 passages just to say, let's hone this down. People don't care nearly as much as we do. They're not going to spend any of the time that we're going to spend. How do we, with a busy culture, with people moving 1,000,000 miles an hour, how do we give them less content more often?
Yeah.
So I'm very, very passionate about that to say, it's not about giving them everything we know. Because that's what happens. If we don't do things on an ongoing basis, we panic and say we better talk to everybody about everything. And then everybody walks out overwhelmed.
Yeah,
so
that's great.
Honing that down.
And what's the last one here, Ted?
I think moving from programs to a process. This isn't necessarily about adding some new complicated program, which a lot of, people are listening and they're like, hey, I'm going to try to talk my pastor into this or whoever about this. The last thing a pastor wants to hear is you need to implement another program, right? He's going to push back. She's going to push back. We don't have the time. We don't have the budget and energy to this. But if we can help create a process that churches can point couples to, whether that's even a church saying, hey, there's this great podcast we want you to listen to. Hey, we're going to send you out on dates, and we've got date night bags in the back. Or, hey, we're going to send you this monthly email that we're basically creating, send it to churches, and they send it out. And let the events things come later. But say, start partnering with marriages by saying, like, after from up front, just making it a part of that strategy, making it a part of the conversation.
Yeah, that's great. I'm sitting here, Ted, and I'm thinking like, man, this is stuff I've never thought about or heard before. And again, I'm not in marriage ministry. You are. Afton's not either. We're just, sitting around with you at the table here. And I'm just realizing, man, you don't know what you don't know. And I guess sitting here as someone who goes to church and who cares about my marriage, this is great stuff to look for in a church for you and your spouse. And if not, then that's what this whole podcast is about is, hey, how can you bring some of this stuff to your church? Like I've never thought about, hey, let's move from information to experience. I've never thought about, hey, let's move from an event to a process or a strategy, if you will. And just learning some of this equips me to not only look for some of these things for my wife in our church, like, hey, is my church setting us up well? And if not, then we get to the question of, okay, do I need to find a church that does this, or what does this look like to bring some of this stuff to my church? Because they might not realize this stuff either. They might not realize, hey, marriage ministry is more than a program. It's more than just information, and it's more than just general marriage tips. Like there's a better way to do this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we can take a lot of our cues from what we've learned from children's ministry and student ministry. I mean, I think about the difference of what my kids have experienced through children's ministry and what I experienced. It's light years. And I think we can do the same thing in the marriage ministry space. And
That's great, yeah.
And you think about like what works. And let's think about student ministry. Like there's things that happen in large groups that can only happen in large groups, right? There's things that we can cast vision and energy and praise and worship and all these different things that we can give kids and students there. I think the same thing is true. There's things that you can only do in large groups that you can do in large groups. The other thing, there's things that happen in small groups that only happen in small groups. Like we know for sure with student ministry, we can say, we're going to make camp so great, we don't even need to meet until next year. We would go, that's ludicrous.
Right, yeah.
But we wouldn't say don't do camp. We would say do camp and.
Right.
That's a
We do
great example.
Camp and small groups. So the same thing, again, things happen in small group, only happen in small groups. It's that support. It's that encouragement. And finally, we want kids in student ministry to have habits when we're not around, right?
Yeah.
We know that they're without us way more than they're with us. So we want to have these habits. The same thing with marriage. Like we want to resource that when we're not around. That's why we do this podcast, because we want to help you when we're not around, when the church is not around. Here's a blog. Here's a date night. Here's conversations that you can have in the rhythm of your life instead of asking you to run with the rhythm of the churches, right?
Sure,
We
yeah.
want to come into where you are in your world.
And I think there's churches that could go all in on the married people strategy, and they could have a process, they could have programs, they could have, and it would be so great to find a church that is all in on that, because how great would that be? But I think there's probably a few people that are listening that are like, I'm never going to walk through the doors of a church. Like been there, done that, or just not going to do that. And what I think is so great for those people that are listening is you can take the first step of, obviously you are, of listening to this podcast or going to Married People website and getting those resources that are just directly to you, and still take those steps and make it part of your rhythm. Even if your church isn't doing it, even if you're not going to go to church, you can put these small deposits throughout your marriage that just be connected to married people and what we're trying to do to help individuals too.
That's great.
100%, because the thing that would break my heart is like, I really believe in the church being the body that surrounds couples. But then I thought about the couple that left that church and, they went to a different area, and them being on their own and not having those things. And so that's one of this podcast is here and this new blog. I mean, we've made a pretty big paradigm shift by adding straight to couples resources. And it was for that reason, for somebody who's still, they're on their own this thing. That's why we love to do this podcast.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Ted, we've talked a whole lot about what a great marriage ministry looks like and what a church needs to do to shift from a reactionary or topical or hands-off mindset to one that's proactive in the marriage space. But if someone's driving around in their car and they're like, hey, I just go to a church, or like I go once or twice a month, like what can they do to bring some of this stuff to their church? What does this look like for them, for us, for Afton and I?
I would just say, you can always ask great questions of church leaders, right? Because great things happen. Our pastor used to say, where there's a problem, there's a passion, right? So I would say, don't bring your church a problem, right? You bring them a passion, and you may just want to share this podcast with your church leadership and say, hey, I was driving down the road and I heard this, and I thought, maybe our church could consider doing this. It seems kind of different. It seems different than what I've seen. And just share that with leadership. And for some of you, it's very, very passionate, because again, we see a lot of churches where the marriage ministry is being ran by volunteers. In fact, I was just at a church where their whole marriage ministry was ran by 3 couples, all of which were on their second marriages, because they were like, we want to help that not happen. So maybe somebody thinks they're not qualified to do this. Well, if we're waiting to be qualified to talk about marriage when ours is perfect, if that's no one's helping anybody, right? And so I really want to
look at Afton and I.
Yeah, we just show up here.
We're just talking about we've got perfect marriages, which is why we are here.
Yeah, so don't wait your perfect to say we want to help.
So what's the one simple thing then that we can really drive at this week?
Yeah, so I would say this, if Afton mentioned the couple or the person that's like, we're not in church world right now, like this doesn't speak to me, I would say go to marriedpeople.org, and there's resources for you there. If you are interested in helping your church help marriages, or you just want to point at marriedpeoplechurches.org, push this podcast there, push them toward this website and say, this may be something that you want to check out. And if you do, I'd be glad to help you implement some of this. And you can take baby steps. It's okay to take baby steps with this thing.
So you're saying, hey, reach out to your church and send them to marriedpeoplechurches.org. And if you're not a church person, marriedpeople.org is the place for you to continue to resource your marriage and to help resource other marriages. Because that's really what we're talking about this week is other people's marriages.
Yeah, and I would just say, I think church leadership, they're more receptive to stuff like this than you would think. You know what I mean? Like, I think...
Because they don't know what they don't know.
And I think it's almost like teachers. It's like they don't hear, you only hear the complaints. You only hear the, like, my marriage is in crisis, why don't you do anything? Or why don't you have this? Or I went on Sunday and there weren't enough donuts. And it's like, how great would it be for a church leader to open their inbox on Monday and go, hey, I heard this cool thing, you might want to check it out. Like, that's so rare for a church leader to get, that if you were the person that was tweeting at them just an idea or sending them an email or just in person going, I heard this cool thing, I think you wouldn't be, loading them up with more things they have to think about. You're giving them a helpful tool that they would be so appreciative to get, you know?
Especially when you add to that equation, hey, if this is something you're interested in, I'm interested in it too, I'd love to help.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that, Afton. That's a great call.
That's great. And as we wrap up this conversation, first I want to say, Ted, your passion for this subject is very evident. And I think that's very cool. Like, this is your thing. And I think one of the things that I just get from sitting here is like, wow, like, you care so much about this. And that is awesome. I'm so glad there are people like you who are pushing at this because not a lot of people are. And it's a lot more important than we tend to give it credit, you know? So I appreciate your heart in all of this for sure.
Not even about marriage ministry. I'm like, I don't know if I've ever met anybody as passionate about anything as Ted is about marriage ministry.
Right. Yeah. No,
He's
that's
the most
true.
passionate person about anything that I've ever met anyone being.
Right.
It's amazing.
And he's so old. How is that possible?
And I don't know if Afton's ever going to go to a marriage event, but I think
We'll
you brought her
see.
one step closer.
I'm one step. I'm doing the podcast. I'll listen to and I'll
I
do
love
like
that.
some dating. I'm getting there.
I love that you're on a podcast about marriage. Like, that's like way down the field as far as involved.
I'm here to just be the like naysayer. I'm here
yes.
to like.
Oh, we know.
I'm a voice of the people.
Yes.
You were hand selected for that reason, Afton. You were hand selected for that reason.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
That's great.
Oh my
gosh. This has been a fun conversation. And hey, as we wrap up, we want to hear from you, right, Afton?
Yeah, we want to hear. So here's our question that we want to ask you to tell us, because it helps us do more research too. What is something that you would find appealing about marriage ministry? What
That's
is
great.
something that would make you show up if you saw there was going to be something there that made you want to go, like a grill or a million puppies?
What would
or
Afton? Before I tell people
What would
where they
make me
can
show
leave
up?
their comments, what would actually make you show up to a marriage event?
what would make me show up to a marriage event? Well, first of all, food. Like, if there's any kind of food. Like, what if there was a cereal buffet? Whoa,
Okay.
that'd be
a good idea.
That's a
That's a
fantastic
good one.
idea. Cereal night.
A cereal night. I would totally go to that. And then if it was a bring your own dogs kind of night, like BYO dogs, like bring them,
Making me so happy.
bring
right
them
now.
all.
That's great.
A cereal night with dogs. I'd be there,
Yeah,
showing up.
Those with pet allergies and who are lactose
Not allowed.
intolerant are not excited
Not
about
for
this,
you.
but
They're not
we'll have
excited about
another.
anything, probably, anyway.
That's true. That's a good point. Well, Afton, I think that's a great idea, and that's a great example of the feedback we're looking for. So we want to hear your ideas, and you can leave us your ideas on our Facebook, Instagram, or podcast episode page. And you can visit our Facebook page at facebook.com/marriedpeople, Instagram at instagram.com/married_people, or just search Married People on Instagram. There will pop up. And you can leave us your comments on our episode page at marriedpeople.org/podcast. Well, thank you for joining us for this week's episode of the podcast. We hope that today's episode helped you realize that marriage is a little easier than you think. And if you enjoyed this episode, we would love for you to subscribe to the podcast through your Apple Podcasts app or wherever you listen to your episodes. And while you're there, leave us a review. Your review helps us make this podcast better and will help us get these conversations in front of more couples who need to hear them. And finally, we are going to have a list of resources for you on our website, marriedpeople.org/podcast, on our podcast episode page. That's where you can find a link to Married People Churches for churches. And we'll also have a link to this awesome book that Ted wrote with Doug Fields called How Your Church Can Build Marriages. It's a book thank you, Afton. It's all about how your local church can build an effective marriage ministry.
Well, the book is called Married People, and the subtitle is How Your Church Can Build Marriages That Last, right?
Correct.
Ha-ha!
Thanks, Afton. I appreciate
You're
you.
looking at the book cover.
I know.
The book is called Married People. Just so we're clear. Anyway.
Okay,
Just
so
wanted
the
to
book is
correct you
called
because you were
the
wrong.
book is called Married People: How Your Church Can Build Marriages That Last.
And it's probably really funny.
It's a nice book.
This is a
Afton
nice
and I are both holding copies of it here. Afton,
Yeah.
this is
It's got some fun in it.
yeah, it's
yeah,
got some
for
great,
sure.
some great
Are
stuff.
you
in
so
it.
proud of this, Ted? You wrote it.
Yeah, it was hard. It was a hard write.
It's a
Well, it's probably the first
there's
book
a
of
lot
its
of stuff
kind.
in
It
it.
is
Probably
listen,
why.
I'm still waiting for another one to come out. It is absolutely the first book and only book of its kind. A strategy for marriage ministry. I'm not even
Yeah.
kidding you. Like,
That's
if you
great.
have one, send it our way because I feel like we're living on an island over here. Yeah.
Well, you can find a link to this book and Ted's book, Your Best Us, which is for married couples, on our website, marriedpeople.org/podcast. Until next time, I'm CJ,
I'm Afton.
I'm Ted.
and thank you for listening.